I learned to keep my hands steady long before I learned to trust anyone. The rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows, turning the city outside into a blur of lights and reflections. And inside the restaurant, everything smelled like expensive wine and quiet expectations. The kind of place where people didn't raise their voices because they didn't have to. Power spoke in silence here. And that's exactly why I noticed him the moment he walked in. Not because he was loud, but because the room shifted, like air making space for something heavier, something controlled. Adrian Moretti didn't look around to see who noticed him. He already knew. His dark suit fit like it had been made for him alone. Every step measured, every glance deliberate. And when his eyes finally landed on me, it wasn't curiosity, it was assessment, like I was a detail he hadn't decided was important yet. I lowered my gaze, not out of fear, but because that's what you do when you're holding a tray with 4 crystal glasses worth more than your weekly paycheck. I moved between tables, steady, quiet, invisible, until I wasn't. My elbow brushed the edge of a chair, just enough to tilt the tray, just enough for one glass to slip. I caught it before it shattered, but the sound it made when it hit the tray again echoed louder than it should have. And when I looked up, he was watching, not amused, not annoyed, just interested, like he'd been waiting for something to break. "Careful," he said, his voice low, smooth, controlled, not a warning, more like a test. I nodded. "Once, always," I replied. And that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, because men like him don't let things end when they're still curious. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying me in a way that made the air feel thinner. "You don't look like you belong here," he said, not cruel, just certain, like stating a fact no one else dared to say out loud. I felt the weight of every eye nearby pretending not to listen. I set the tray down carefully, my hands steady, my breathing. "Neither do you," I answered, quiet enough that only he could hear. And that was the moment something changed, not in the room, but in him, a flicker, small, but real, like I'd just stepped outside the script he expected. His lips curved slightly, not a smile, more like acknowledgement, bold. He said, tilting his head just enough to see me differently now, not as staff, not as background, but as something he couldn't categorize, and that seemed to bother him more than anything else, or just honest. I said, and I could feel it then, the shift tightening between us. Invisible but undeniable. He tapped his fingers once against the table, slow, thoughtful, like he was deciding something. Like this wasn't about a dropped glass anymore. "Let's make this interesting," he said, his voice dropping just enough to draw me in without raising attention. "You and me," he continued, eyes locked on mine. A simple challenge. I didn't move, didn't blink, just watched him the way he'd been watching me. And for the first time since he walked in, I saw it. Not power, not control, but curiosity edged with something sharper. "You think I'm weak," I said, not a question, just clarity. His expression didn't change, but his silence confirmed everything. I exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar calm settle into my bones, the kind that only shows up when things are about to shift. "Then you should have looked closer," I said. And somewhere between the rain outside and the quiet tension inside, I knew this night wasn't going to end the way he expected, because men like Adrian Moretti were used to controlling outcomes, and I had spent my whole life surviving them. He did not smile after that. Not really. Just leaned back like a man who had just found something worth his time, and that was more dangerous than anger, because attention from someone like Adrian Moretti was never casual. It was intentional, calculated, and once it landed on you, it did not leave easily. The waiter beside me slowed his steps, pretending to adjust a table setting just to stay close enough to hear. But Adrian did not raise his voice. He never needed to. "A challenge," he repeated, quieter now, like the word itself carried weight. Nothing dramatic, nothing messy, just a test. His eyes flicked down briefly, not to my face, but to my hands. And that was the first mistake he made, because most people looked at my face and saw a waitress. Maybe tired, maybe quiet, but still just someone passing through their night. He looked at my hands and saw something else, something he could not quite name yet. "What kind of test?" I asked, keeping my tone even. The same way I asked customers if they wanted sparkling or still water. Like this was normal, like he was not quietly shifting the ground under both of us. He tapped the table once, then stood, smooth, controlled. The movement alone enough to make two men at the next table instinctively straighten in their seats. The room noticed when he moved, even if they pretended not to. "There is a private space downstairs," he said, not asking, not suggesting, simply stating. "We keep it for entertainment." His pause was deliberate, giving me just enough room to understand what he meant without saying it outright. I felt the weight of the moment settle in my chest. Not fear, not exactly. More like recognition, like I had stepped into something familiar under a different name. "And if I say no?" I asked, watching him carefully now, really watching him. The way he held his shoulders, the way his gaze never wavered, the way control sat on him like a second skin. He tilted his head slightly, considering. "Then you walk away," he said. And for a second, I almost believed him. Almost. But there was something underneath that answer, something unspoken, something that said walking away would not end this, it would only delay it. I exhaled slowly, feeling my pulse steady, my thoughts narrow. The world shrinking down to this table, this man, this moment. "And if I say yes?" I asked, his eyes sharpened, just a fraction, like that was the answer he had been waiting for. "Then we find out if you are as steady as you pretend to be," he said. And there it was again, that word, steady, like he thought that was all I had. Like calm was the only thing holding me together. He did not know calm was what I used when everything else was already decided. I reached up slowly, untied the thin apron string at my waist, the fabric sliding free in one smooth motion, and placed it on the table between us. Not rushed, not dramatic, just final. The small action louder than anything I could have said. The waiter beside me froze, mid-step, as if the entire room had just tilted slightly off balance. Adrian's gaze followed the movement, not surprised, but not entirely prepared either. 5 minutes, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I finished my shift. It was not a request, it was a boundary, and for the first time since he walked in, he did not immediately respond. He just watched me, measuring, recalculating, like he was adjusting to a version of me he had not expected to meet tonight. Then he nodded once, slow, deliberate. 5 minutes, he agreed. And something in the way he said it felt less like permission and more like acknowledgement, like we had just agreed to something neither of us would walk away from unchanged. I turned before he could say anything else, picking up my tray again. The weight familiar, grounding, the same way it had been every night before this one. But everything felt different now, sharper, clearer, like the edges of the world had come into focus. I moved through the room one last time, finishing tables, refilling glasses, answering polite questions with practiced ease. But inside, something had already shifted, something old, something I had spent years keeping quiet. And as I stepped toward the back hallway that led downstairs, I realized this was never about proving him wrong. It was about reminding myself what I had survived. And the moment the door closed behind me, the noise of the restaurant fading into silence, I let my shoulders drop just slightly, just enough to breathe, just enough to remember. He thought he was testing me, but he had no idea what I had been trained to endure. The hallway smelled different from the dining room, less like polished glass and expensive perfume, and more like something honest, concrete and quiet. The kind of space where things did not need to pretend. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and for a second I just stood there, listening to the silence settle. My fingers moved automatically, rolling the tension out of my wrists one slow breath at a time. The same ritual I had not used in years, but never forgot. Muscle memory does not ask for permission. It just returns when it is needed. I reached the bottom of the narrow staircase and pushed open the heavy door. The room beyond was dim, but not dark. Overhead lights casting a muted glow across the floor, not polished like the restaurant, not meant to impress, just functional. A space built for control and observation. A few men stood along the edges, dressed like they belonged upstairs but positioned like they belonged here, quiet, watchful, not surprised to see me, which meant he had already decided this would happen long before I said yes. Adrian was there, of course, standing near the center, jacket removed now, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest ease without losing authority. He did not look at me immediately. He was speaking to someone beside him in a low voice. But the moment I stepped fully into the room, he stopped, like he felt the shift instead of heard it. His gaze found mine and held, longer this time, deeper, like he was trying to solve something that refused to stay simple. "You came," he said, not surprised, but not dismissive either. I walked forward slowly, each step measured, my shoes quiet against the floor. You asked. I replied, my voice steady. Unchanged, the same voice I used upstairs, but everything else about me felt different now. Lighter, clearer, like I had set something down I had been carrying for too long. One of the men near the wall moved slightly, placing a pair of worn gloves on a nearby bench. The gesture subtle but intentional, and that was when Adrian's eyes dropped again, not to my face, not to my uniform, but to my hands, bare now, relaxed at my sides, not clenched, not tense, just ready. You have done this before, he said, more statement than question. I did not answer right away. I stepped closer to the bench, picked up the gloves, the leather soft from use, familiar in a way that felt almost like home. I turned them over once, then set them back down, untouched. I do not need those, I said quietly. And that was the second mistake he made, because for the first time, something flickered across his expression that was not control, not calculation, but interest sharpened into focus. The room seemed to hold its breath, the men along the wall straightening just slightly, like they understood something had shifted even if they did not know what. Adrian took a single step forward, closing part of the distance between us, not aggressive, not rushed, just enough to test the space. Then what do you need? He asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the performance he used upstairs. This was the real version, the one fewer people ever heard. I met his gaze without hesitation, without lowering mine. Nothing, I said, and for a moment neither of us moved, the silence stretching, thick but not uncomfortable, just charged, like the air before a storm that never quite arrives the way you expect. I could feel his attention shift again, not just watching me, but reading me, recalculating every assumption he had made in the last 10 minutes, and I knew that look. I had seen it before, in people who realized too late that they had misunderstood something important, something essential. You still have time to walk away, he said finally, quieter than before, almost like a warning. And that was the third mistake, because he thought this was about choice, about stepping in or out, about control. I shook my head once, slow, certain. I walked in a long time ago, I said, and I meant it in a way he could not possibly understand yet. Not about this room, not about him, but about every moment that had led me here, every lesson carved into muscle and memory, every reason I learned how to stand without shaking. The lights hummed softly overhead, the city noise faint through the walls, and in that small, contained space, something shifted between us again, not visible, not spoken, but real. He thought he was about to see what I could do, but what he did not realize was that I was about to show him why I learned it in the first place. The room did not get louder when we moved. It got quieter, the kind of quiet that pulls attention instead of losing it. One of the men stepped forward as if to speak, but stopped when Adrian raised a single hand. Not sharply, just enough. Control without effort. That was how he operated. Everything measured, everything intentional. I stepped into the open space at the center, not rushing, not hesitating, just arriving. My shoes aligned with the faint marks on the floor that told me this place had been used before, not for show, but for something real. I rolled my shoulders once, slow, feeling the tension settle into something usable, something precise. Adrian watched every movement, not missing anything now, not the way my weight shifted, not the way my breathing stayed even, not the way my eyes never left his. You are not nervous, he said, and this time it sounded less like an observation and more like a question he did not expect to ask. I tilted my head slightly, considering him the same way he had considered me upstairs. I learned early, I said quietly. Nervous does not help. He exhaled once through his nose, almost a silent laugh, but there was no humor in it, just acknowledgement. He stepped forward, closing the last of the distance, but still leaving space, still giving the illusion of choice. This is where people prove things, he said, his voice steady, carrying just enough for everyone in the room to hear without raising it, or lose them. I added, and something in the air shifted again, subtle, but real. One of the men near the wall glanced at Adrian, waiting for a signal, waiting for direction. But Adrian did not look away from me. Not this time. He was past that, past the performance. This was personal now, even if he did not fully understand why. No audience rules, he said. almost as if reminding himself. No spectacle. I nodded once, because I understood that this was not about showing off. This was about something quieter, something deeper, something that did not need noise to be real. He moved first, not aggressively, not abruptly, just a shift forward, testing space, testing reaction. I did not step back. I did not rush forward. I stayed exactly where I was, letting the distance close by inches instead of feet, controlled, deliberate, and I saw it then. The exact moment he realized I was not reacting the way he expected, not flinching, not adjusting, not giving him anything easy to read. His eyes narrowed just slightly, recalibrating, searching for the pattern he always found in people. But I had spent years learning how not to give patterns away, how to hold still even when everything inside wanted to move, how to wait, because waiting is not weakness, it is control. You are different, he said finally, softer now, almost to himself, and I felt something tighten in my chest at those words, not fear, not pride, just memory, flashes of a place that did not look like this, smaller, colder, where the lights flickered and the air smelled like old dust and determination, where I learned to stand my ground long before I had a choice. I blinked once, bringing myself back to the present, back to this room, this moment, this man who thought he was discovering something new. No, I said, my voice steady, grounded. You just never looked at someone like me before. The words landed between us, heavier than anything else that had been said. And for the first time since this began, Adrian did not respond immediately. He just watched me, really watched me, like he was seeing past the surface now, past the uniform, past the assumptions, into something he could not control. And that was when I moved, not fast, not dramatic, just one precise step forward, closing the space on my terms instead of his, and the shift was instant. The room felt it, the men along the walls felt it, and Adrian felt it most of all, because control had just changed hands. Not loudly, not violently, but undeniably, and in that quiet, measured moment, I saw it clearly in his eyes, not fear, not yet, but something close to respect, the kind that does not come from power, but from recognition. And that was when I understood, this was never about proving I was stronger, it was about showing him he had been wrong from the very beginning. He did not step back when I closed the distance, and that told me everything I needed to know about him. Not fearless, not reckless, just unwilling to yield in a way that had probably worked his entire life. But this was not his world anymore, not fully, not in the way he thought. The air between us tightened, not hostile, not explosive, just precise, like two people measuring something invisible but important. Adrian's gaze did not leave mine, but it changed, subtly, the sharp edge of control, softening into something more focused, more aware, like he was no longer trying to dominate the moment, but understand it. You are not reacting, he said, quieter now, almost thoughtful, and I could hear it in his voice, the shift, the realization that whatever he expected to happen here was not happening. I let a slow breath out, steady, grounded, the kind of breath that comes from knowing exactly where you are and why. I am choosing, I said. And that was the difference he had not accounted for. Most people reacted to him, adjusted around him, bent under the weight of his presence. But I was not adjusting, I was deciding, and that unsettled him more than anything else could have. One of the men near the wall shifted again, a small movement, but it carried tension, like the room itself was waiting for something to break. But nothing broke, nothing rushed, because this was never about speed, it was about control, and control does not shout, it whispers. Adrian took another step, not closing the space entirely, but enough to test the line again, and I let him, because the line was not where he thought it was. It had already moved, already changed, already become mine. Who taught you? He asked, the question coming out before he could stop it. And that was new. That was the first time he had asked instead of declared. I tilted my head slightly, feeling the weight of that question settle somewhere deeper than I expected. Not uncomfortable, just familiar, like hearing a song you have not listened to in years but still remember every word. No one you would know, I said. And it was true, because the people who teach you how to survive do not leave names behind. They leave habits, instincts, scars you learn to carry quietly. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in concentration. like he was trying to piece together a story from fragments he did not have access to. And for the first time, I saw it. Clearly, not the boss, not the man everyone moved around, but the person underneath, the one who needed to understand things in order to control them. And that was why this moment mattered more than he realized, because he could not control what he could not define. "You are not here to prove anything," he said slowly, like he was working it out as he spoke, and I felt a small shift inside my chest at that. Not because he was right, but because he was finally asking the right question. I shook my head once, calm, certain. "No," I said. "I am here because you thought you understood me." And the silence that followed was heavier than anything else that had filled the room tonight. The men along the walls were no longer pretending not to watch. They were fully focused now, drawn into something they could not quite explain. Adrian held my gaze, unblinking, and I could see it. The moment the realization landed, not fully, not completely, but enough to change something fundamental, enough to shift the balance in a way that could not be undone. He exhaled slowly, a controlled release of tension that had been building without him noticing. And when he spoke again, his voice was different, not weaker, not softer. "Just honest, then show me," he said. And there was no challenge in it now, no arrogance, just a request. And that was when I understood. This was the real turning point. Not the moment we stepped into this room, not the moment he issued the challenge, but this quiet shift from control to curiosity, from assumption to awareness. I took one more step forward, closing the last of the space completely, not to threaten, not to dominate, but to make something clear without saying it out loud. And in that moment, with nothing but silence and steady breathing between us, I let him see it. Not through force, not through spectacle, but through presence alone. The years, the discipline, the reason I never shook when the world expected me to. And I watched his expression change, just slightly, just enough, as he finally understood that strength does not always look loud, and control does not always belong to the one who claims it. He did not move when I stepped fully into his space, and neither did I. The distance between us gone now, replaced by something quieter, something heavier, not tension, not conflict, just awareness, the kind that settles deep in your chest when you realize a moment matters more than you expected. The room stayed silent, no one shifting, no one speaking, like even the air understood this was not something to interrupt. Adrian's eyes searched mine, not for weakness anymore, not for hesitation, but for truth, and that was the difference, the shift that changed everything. "You could have walked away," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful now, not a command, not a test, just a statement shaped like a question. I held his gaze, steady, unblinking. "So could you?" I answered, and the words landed softer than anything else that had been said tonight, but they carried more weight then. All of it combined, because this was no longer about proving strength. This was about choice, about two people standing in a moment neither of them expected to reach. He exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that felt different from before, less guarded, more real, like something inside him had shifted without permission. His shoulders relaxed just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to see, because I had spent years learning to read the smallest changes, the ones people thought no one would catch. "You do not fight like someone who wants to win," he said. And this time it was not a challenge, it was recognition. I felt something tighten in my chest again, not fear, not anger, just memory, quiet and sharp. "No," I said softly. "I fight like someone who refuses to lose herself." And for a moment, the words hung between us, unguarded, honest in a way I did not usually allow. The kind of honesty that does not come from comfort, but from experience, the kind you earn. Adrian's expression changed again, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know what to look for, but I saw it. The exact second he understood that this had nothing to do with him, nothing to do with control or dominance or proving anything. This was about something deeper, something he had not expected to encounter tonight, something he could not command or predict. The men along the walls shifted slightly, not out of impatience, but because the energy in the room had changed, the expected outcome dissolving into something quieter, something more complicated. Adrian took a small step back then, not retreating, not yielding, just adjusting, creating space where there had been none. And that single movement said more than anything else he could have done, because men like him did not step back unless they chose to. And he had just chosen to. I let the silence stretch for another second, letting the moment settle, letting it become real. Then I reached for the gloves again, not to put them on, but to move them aside, clearing the space between us completely. Nothing left to suggest this was a game or a performance. Just two people standing face to face, understanding something neither of them had expected. This is where you stop testing people, I said quietly, my voice steady, grounded, not accusing, not harsh, just certain. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in resistance, but in thought, like he was turning the words over in his mind, examining them from every angle. And for the first time since this began, he did not immediately respond. He just stood there, listening, really listening. And that was when I knew the fight he had expected was never going to happen, not in the way he imagined, because the real shift had already taken place, not in movement, not in force, but in understanding. And as the silence settled fully around us, I saw it clearly in his eyes, the realization forming, slow but undeniable, that control was not something you could take from someone who had already learned how to keep it, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was stand still and refuse to become what the world expected them to be. The silence did not break, it settled, deeper, heavier, like something had been decided without either of us needing to say it out loud. Adrian's gaze remained on me, but it was no longer searching, no longer trying to define or control. It was absorbing, like he was letting the moment exist without forcing it into something smaller, something simpler. And that alone told me more about him than anything else tonight. Because men like him did not just stop, they did not pause unless something made them. And I realized then that this was new for him. This stillness, this lack of outcome, this space where nothing had to be proven. One of the men along the wall shifted his weight, the faint sound of his shoe against the floor echoing slightly in the quiet, like a reminder that the world outside this moment still existed, still moved, still expected something to happen, but nothing did, not the way they thought it would. Adrian glanced briefly toward the edges of the room, just for a second, acknowledging the presence of others. Then his attention returned to me, fully, deliberately. They expected a show, he said, his voice calm, measured, but different now, stripped of performance. I followed his glance for just a moment, taking in the still figures, the quiet anticipation that had not yet faded. Then I looked back at him. People usually do, I said, and there was no bitterness in it. Just truth, the kind that did not need to be softened or explained. He nodded once, slow, like he understood more than he was willing to say. And maybe he did. Maybe this was not the first time something had not gone the way he planned, but I could tell it was the first time he had allowed it to stay that way. Without forcing it back into his control, he stepped back another half step, creating more space between us, not as distance, but as respect. And that shift, small as it was, changed everything in the room. The tension dissolved into something quieter, something steadier, like a held breath finally released. You are not what I expected, he said, and this time there was no edge to it, no challenge, just acknowledgement. I let the words settle before answering, because this was not about correcting him, not really. You expected someone easier, I said, and I watched his expression carefully. The way his jaw tightened just slightly, the way his eyes held mine without looking away. He did not deny it. He did not argue. And that told me I was right. He exhaled slowly, running a hand briefly along the back of his neck, a small, almost unnoticeable gesture, but one that did not match the man who had walked into the restaurant earlier. That man did not show moments like this, did not reveal uncertainty, but this one did, even if only for a second. Maybe I did, he admitted. And the honesty in his voice was unexpected, not because he was incapable of it, but because he did not have to offer it. And yet he did. I nodded once, accepting it without making more of it than necessary, because that was the thing about truth. It did not need to be expanded to be understood. The room remained quiet, but the energy had shifted completely now, no longer waiting, no longer tense, just aware, like everyone present had witnessed something they could not fully explain. Adrian glanced at the gloves on the bench, then back at me, and there was a faint trace of something in his expression, something almost like realization. This was never about that, he said, More to himself than to me. I shook my head slightly. No, I replied, and for a moment, we stood there again, not as opponents, not as strangers, but as two people who had stepped into a moment neither of them could control, and had chosen not to force it into something it was not. Adrian straightened slightly then, the familiar composure returning, but not in the same way as before. This time it felt less like armor and more like balance, like he was not hiding behind it, just carrying it differently. He looked at me one last time, steady, focused, and there was something new in his gaze now, something quieter, but stronger than before. You changed the outcome, he said, and I held his gaze without hesitation, without lowering mine. No, I answered softly. I just refused to follow yours. And in that moment, I knew this night would stay with him, not because of what happened, but because of what did not. Because sometimes the most powerful thing is not the fight itself, but the choice not to become part of one at all. The moment should have ended there, clean, quiet, finished, but something in the air refused to settle completely, like the night itself was holding on to what had just happened, unwilling to let it fade into something ordinary. Adrian did not turn away immediately, and neither did I. The space between us no longer tense, no longer charged, but not empty either. It held something else now, something unspoken but understood, the kind of silence that follows realization, not confusion. One of the men near the wall finally exhaled audibly, a small break in the stillness that reminded everyone they were still standing in a room, not a memory. Adrian's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but softer, less guarded, like he was no longer bracing for impact, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to control. What happens now? He asked, and the question felt different from anything else he had said tonight. Not strategic, not calculated, just real. I considered it for a second. Not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to be sure he understood it, now. I repeated quietly, letting the words sit between us. Now I go back upstairs, I said, simple, direct, the way truth usually is when you do not try to dress it up. Something flickered across his face, not disappointment, not resistance, just recognition, like he had expected something more complicated and found something clearer instead. And this just ends? He asked, not challenging, just trying to understand the boundaries of something he had not planned for. I nodded once, steady, certain. It already did, I replied, and for a moment, that answer seemed to hold him in place, not physically, but mentally, like he was replaying the last 10 minutes, fitting them into a structure that made sense to him, the kind of structure he had built his life around. But this did not fit neatly, it did not resolve the way things usually did for him. And that was the point. I turned slightly then, not abruptly, not dismissively, just enough to signal movement, to shift from stillness into action, because staying would turn this into something else, something it was never meant to be. And I had learned a long time ago that knowing when to leave is just as important as knowing when to stand your ground. I took a step toward the door, the sound of my shoes soft against the floor, controlled, measured. The same way I had walked in, but different now, lighter, clearer, behind me. I could feel his attention still there, not pulling, not demanding, just present. And that was new. That was something he had not done before. Letting something exist without trying to shape it. Chloe, he said, my name steady on his voice, not loud, but enough to stop me for half a second. I did not turn around immediately, just paused, listening. You knew, he continued, and I could hear it in the way he said it. Not accusation, not confusion, just realization. I turned my head slightly, just enough for him to see my profile, not fully facing him, not fully turned away, balanced between both. About you, he clarified. About me. I answered simply, because that was the truth. I had known the moment he walked in, not who he was exactly, but what he represented, the kind of man who tested people to understand them, the kind of man who expected control to answer every question. And you still said yes, he said, quieter now, and I could hear something else in his voice, something close to respect, maybe even curiosity that had not fully settled yet. I let a small breath out, almost a laugh, but not quite. I said yes to myself, I replied, and that was the part he needed to understand, the part that changed everything. This was never about him, never about proving something to him. This was about not letting anyone else define the limits of what I could be. I turned fully then, facing the door, my hand reaching for the handle, the cool metal grounding under my fingers, and before I opened it, I added one last thing, not louder, not softer, just clear. You do not need to test people to see who they are, I said, pausing just long enough for the words to land. You just have to stop assuming first. I opened the door then, the faint noise from upstairs drifting down, the world continuing exactly as it had before we stepped into this room. And without looking back, I stepped through, leaving the silence behind me. Because some lessons are not meant to be explained, they are meant to be experienced, and whether he understood it fully or not, I knew one thing for certain. He would not look at the next person the same way. Again, I pushed through the door and the sound of the restaurant wrapped around me again. Soft music, quiet conversations, the steady rhythm of glasses meeting tables, everything exactly where it had been before, like nothing downstairs had happened at all. And for a second that contrast almost made me pause, almost made me question if the shift I felt was real or just something I imagined in the silence below. But then I exhaled slowly and kept walking, because I knew better than that. Moments like that do not disappear just because the world continues. They settle somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, and they stay. I moved back behind the service counter, picking up my tray again, the familiar weight grounding, the routine slipping back over me like a second skin. One of the other servers glanced at me, eyebrows raised slightly. "Everything okay?" he asked, casual, like he was asking about a late order or a missing glass. I nodded once, steady. "Yeah," I said, and it was not a lie, not really, just incomplete. Because how do you explain something like that in a place like this? How do you put it into words that make sense in a room where people measure value by what they can see? I stepped back onto the floor, moving between tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates, the same motions I had done 100 times before. But something in me had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to change the way I carried myself, the way I held my shoulders, the way I looked at the people around me. Like I was no longer just moving through their world, I was choosing to be there, and that difference mattered more than anyone else could see. I reached one of my tables, setting down a glass of water with steady hands. The customer thanked me without really looking, already turning back to his conversation, and I almost smiled, because that used to bother me, used to feel like invisibility, but now it just felt like space, like freedom. The door at the far end of the room opened quietly, and I did not have to look to know it was him. The shift in the air was enough, not as heavy as before, not as commanding, just present. I finished placing the glass before I let my eyes lift, and there he was. Adrian Moretti, standing near the entrance, not moving through the room the way he had earlier, not claiming it, just standing there, watching, not in the same way as before either, no longer assessing, no longer searching for weakness, just observing. Like he was seeing something new in a place he thought he understood completely. Our eyes met for a brief second, and that was enough. No words, no gestures, just recognition. And something else, something quieter, like respect that did not need to be announced. I turned away first, not out of avoidance, but because the moment did not need to stretch any longer than it already had. I had said what needed to be said, not with words, but with presence, and that was enough. I continued moving through the room, finishing my shift, each step steady, each breath even, the rhythm of the night carrying on as if nothing had changed. But I knew better, and I suspected he did too, because when I glanced back once more, just briefly, he was still there, still watching, but not in the way he had before, not like someone trying to control the outcome, but like someone who had just realized there are things in this world that cannot be controlled at all. And for a man like him, that realization would not fade easily. It would stay, settle, reshape the way he saw the next person, the next moment, the next choice. And as I picked up my tray one last time, moving toward the final table of the night, I understood something just as clearly. I had not changed him completely, not in one night, but I had done something more important. I had made him pause, and sometimes, for someone who never stops, that is where everything begins. The night moved toward its end the way it always did, quietly, without announcement, tables emptying one by one, conversations fading into soft goodbyes, the steady rhythm of the room slowing into something softer, something easier to breathe in. I carried the last tray back to the service counter and set it down gently, The sound of glass against wood sharper now in the near silence. My shift was almost over, just a few final details. A few final motions, the kind that usually blurred together. At the end of a long night. But not tonight. Tonight everything felt clearer, more defined. Like every small movement mattered in a way it had not before. I wiped down the counter slowly, methodical, controlled, my mind not racing, not distracted, just present, fully present in a way I had not allowed myself in a long time. One of the servers beside me stretched his arms and let out a tired sigh. Long night, he muttered, and I nodded, not because of the hours, but because of everything that had happened within them. Yeah, I said quietly, and again, it was true in more ways than he could understand. The front door opened again, softer this time, not with presence, not with weight, just movement. I glanced up without thinking, and there he was, still there. Adrian had not left, not yet. He stood near the entrance again, but something about him was different now. Not smaller, not diminished, just still, like he was no longer pushing against the space around him, no longer bending it to fit him. He simply stood within it, observing, considering. I watched him for a moment longer than I meant to, and this time, when our eyes met, there was no tension at all, just recognition, quiet and steady, like two people who had shared something they did not need to explain. He did not approach, did not speak, did not try to pull me back into anything, and that alone said more than anything he could have done. I turned back to my work, finishing the last of my tasks, folding a clean cloth, placing it neatly beside the register, small, precise actions that grounded me in the present, because that is where I chose to stay, not in the moment downstairs, not in what it meant or what it might change, just here, now, where I could control what came next. A few minutes later, the manager called out that we were closing, chairs being lifted, lights dimming slightly, the end of the night settling in fully. I untied my apron again, slower this time, not as a signal, not as a statement, just routine, and I placed it down on the counter with care, like it deserved that much. I grabbed my bag from the back, slipping the strap over my shoulder, the familiar weight settling comfortably. A reminder of everything outside this place, everything beyond this night. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel it again, that presence, not heavy, not commanding, just there, waiting without expectation. Adrian stood to the side of the door now, not blocking it, not controlling it, just allowing. And that was new. That was something I knew did not come easily to him. I slowed just slightly as I approached, not stopping, not hesitating, just acknowledging the space between us one last time. Good night, he said, simple, direct, no edge, no hidden meaning, just a word. I looked at him, really looked at him, not as a boss, not as a challenge, just as a person standing in front of me. And I saw it clearly. The shift had stayed. It had not faded with time or distance. It had settled into in the way real things do, quietly, permanently. Good night, I replied, my voice steady, and for a second, that was all there was. No more questions, no more tests. Just a moment that did not need to be anything else. I stepped past him then, pushing the door open, the cool night air meeting me instantly. The city alive in a different way outside, louder, freer, less contained. I took a breath, deep and steady, feeling it fill my lungs, grounding me in something real, something mine. And as I walked away from the building, the lights fading behind me with each step, I did not look back, because I did not need to. Some moments do not follow you. They stay where they happened, shaping everything that comes after without needing to be revisited, and I knew, without question, that tonight was one of them. Not because of what was said, not because of what almost happened, but because of what changed quietly, beneath the surface, where it mattered most. The night air stayed with me longer than usual, cool against my skin as I walked down the sidewalk, the city stretching out in front of me in quiet motion, headlights passing, distant conversations echoing off buildings, everything moving forward like it always did, but I was not moving through it the same way. Something had settled inside me, not heavy, not overwhelming, just clear, like a line had been drawn, and I had finally seen it for what it was. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, the familiar weight grounding me as I turned the corner toward my apartment, a place that had always felt temporary, like somewhere I stayed but never fully belonged. But tonight, even that felt different, not because the place had changed, But because I had stopped waiting for something else to define where I stood, I reached the front steps and paused for a second, not out of hesitation, just to breathe, to let the quiet settle completely, the kind of quiet that only comes when everything unnecessary falls away. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The soft click behind me sealing off the noise of the street. The small space greeted me the way it always did. Simple, functional, nothing extra. But tonight it felt enough. More than enough. I set my bag down by the chair and slipped off my shoes, the tension in my shoulders easing without me thinking about it. I moved toward the sink, turning on the faucet, letting the water run over my hands. Warm, steady, real. I watched it for a moment. The way it moved without resistance, without effort, and something about that felt right, like a quiet reminder that not everything needs to be forced to exist. I dried my hands slowly and leaned back against the counter, my mind not racing, not replaying every detail the way it usually would after a night that did not go as planned. Because this had not been about what happened, it had been about what did not, and that difference mattered more than anything else. I thought about him for a moment, not in the way I used to think about people like him, not as something to avoid or something to prove myself against, just as a person who had stepped into a moment and seen something he had not expected. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to carry that with me. I did not need to wonder what he would do next, or how it would affect anything beyond that room, because whatever changed in him was his to hold, not mine. I pushed away from the counter and walked toward the small window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the street below, the city still moving, still alive, still unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place hours earlier. And that was the thing about moments like that. They do not announce themselves to the world. They stay contained, shaping people from the inside out, unseen but undeniable. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, the cool surface grounding me again, and I realized something then, something simple but steady. I did not need to be seen to be strong. I did not need to prove anything to anyone who tried to define me before understanding me. I had already learned what mattered, already built what could not be taken, and that was enough, more than enough. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned off the light, the room settling into darkness, calm and still, and as I moved toward the bed, the quiet wrapping around me fully now, I knew that whatever came next, whatever tomorrow brought, I would meet it the same way I met tonight, not by reacting, not by proving, but by choosing, because in the end, that was the only thing anyone truly owned. Not control, not power, not expectation, just the choice to remain exactly who they decided to be, no matter who was watching. Morning did not arrive loudly. It slipped in quietly through the thin edges of the curtain, soft light spreading across the room like it had all the time in the world, and for once, I woke up before the alarm, not startled, not tense, just awake, fully, clearly, like my mind had already decided there was nothing left to replay, nothing left to solve. I stayed still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the city beginning again outside, distant traffic, a door closing somewhere down the hall, life continuing in its usual rhythm, and I realized something then, something small but undeniable. I felt rested, not just physically, but in a way that went deeper than sleep. Like something inside me had finally settled into place. I sat up slowly, running a hand through my hair. The movement simple, familiar, and yet it felt different, lighter, like I was not carrying the same invisible weight I had gotten used to over the years. I stood and crossed the room, pulling the curtain back fully this time, letting the daylight fill the space without hesitation. The street below looked ordinary, people walking, cars passing, nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. And that was exactly what made it real, because the most important shifts do not change the world around you. They change how you stand inside it. I moved through my morning routine without rushing, without distraction, each step deliberate, grounded. I poured a glass of water, took a slow sip, feeling the quiet steadiness of it. No urgency, no pressure, just presence. And that presence stayed with me as I got ready for the day, as I tied my shoes, as I picked up my bag, as I stepped outside into the cool air that still lingered from the night before. The walk back toward the restaurant felt different too, not because the path had changed, but because I was no longer walking into it the same way. I was not bracing for anything, not preparing for someone to test me, not expecting to prove anything. I was just going, and that alone shifted everything. When I pushed open the door, the familiar scent of coffee and polished wood greeted me, the soft hum of early customers already filling the space. Everything exactly where it should be. I stepped behind the counter, setting my bag down, slipping back into the rhythm of the place. But this time, I noticed the difference immediately, not in the room, but in how I moved through it, how I looked at people, how I held myself without thinking about it. One of the servers glanced at me and smiled. "You look different," she said casually, like it was just an observation, not a question. I paused for a second, considering that, then nodded slightly. "Maybe I am," I replied, and it felt true in a way I did not need to explain. The door opened again, and for a split second, the air shifted, not as strongly as before, not as sharply, but enough for me to notice. I did not look immediately. I did not react. I just finished placing the order in front of a customer, thanked them, and then, when the moment felt right, I glanced up. Adrian stood near the entrance again, but this time, everything about him was different, not in appearance, not in presence, but in intention. He was not scanning the room, not controlling it, not commanding it. He simply stood there, observing, like someone stepping into a place they thought they understood, only to realize there was more beneath the surface. Our eyes met again, and this time, there was no tension at all, no test, no challenge, just recognition, quiet and steady, like something had been acknowledged on both sides without needing to be spoken. I turned back to my work without hesitation, not ignoring him, not avoiding him, just choosing where my focus belonged. And as I moved through the room, steady and calm, I understood something clearly. The night before had not changed who I was. It had revealed it. And that difference was everything, because once you see yourself clearly, no one else gets to define you again. The rhythm of the morning settled into something steady, something almost familiar, but not in the same way it had before. It felt clearer now, like every movement had intention instead of habit. I moved between tables with quiet precision, not rushing, not hesitating, just present, fully present, and that presence followed me through every step, every glance. Every breath. The door opened again, and this time, I did not need to look to know he was still there, not because of the shift in the room, but because something in me recognized it without effort, like a pattern that had already been understood. I finished setting down a cup of coffee before I let my eyes lift, and there he was. Adrian Moretti, seated now, not at the center, not commanding the space, just part of it. And that alone said more than anything else could have. He was not here to control, not here to test. He was here to observe, to understand. And that was something new, not just for him, but for the space around him. I approached his table when it was my turn, not sooner, not later, just when it fit naturally into the flow, the way I would with anyone else, because that was the point. He was not an exception anymore, not in the way he expected to be. "What can I get you?" I asked, my voice calm. Even, the same tone I used with every customer, not distant, not familiar, just balanced. He looked up at me, and for a moment, the world narrowed slightly, not dramatically, just enough to feel it. His expression was composed, but there was something different beneath it, something quieter, more grounded, like he was not trying to lead the moment anymore, just be part of it. "Coffee," he said. Simple, direct, no edge, no hidden weight, just a word. I nodded once and turned to prepare it. The motion smooth, practiced, the sound of the machine filling the small space between us, grounding everything in something real. I placed the cup in front of him with steady hands, the same way I had done 100 times before, but this time, when our eyes met again, there was no tension at all, just understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to exist. He glanced at the cup for a second, then back at me. "You were right," he said, and the words were quiet, almost easy, but they carried weight. Not because of what they meant, but because of where they came from. I did not ask him to explain. I did not need to. I already knew. And that was the thing about clarity. Once you have it, you do not need to chase it in other people. You recognize it when it shows up. I gave a small nod, acknowledging it without making more of it than necessary. Because this was not about winning, not about proving anything. It never had been. I turned slightly, ready to move to the next table, but he spoke again, not to stop me. Not to pull me back, just to add something that mattered to him. I will not forget, he said, and there was no promise in it, no expectation, just truth, the kind that stands on its own. I paused for half a second, just enough to let the words settle, then I met his gaze one last time, steady, grounded. You do not have to, I replied softly, and that was it. No more, no less. I moved on, continuing through the room, the rhythm of the morning carrying me forward, but something about that moment stayed, not heavy, not distracting, just present, like a quiet echo that did not fade. And as I stepped back behind the counter, picking up the next order, I understood something fully, something simple but lasting. I had not changed him by force. I had not broken anything. I had simply shown him something different, something he could not ignore, and sometimes, that is enough to shift everything. Not all at once, not completely, but in a way that lasts, because real change does not come from being challenged. It comes from being seen clearly for the first time, and choosing not to look away.